Thank you for downloading this RealAgriculture podcast. Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca.
We're now going to dive into some trade issues related to geopolitics. And honestly, I can't think of a better person to provide some perspective on this issue because, people like myself and others, we have to speculate what's happening inside that trade negotiation room, sort of read the tea leaves, what are we thinking, the signal, getting the signal from the noise. Well, this is the guy that actually knows what's going on because he's in the room. So as Canada's chief trade negotiator, Steve Verheul was responsible for negotiating the new NAFTA agreement, the USMCA. In Canada, we call it the CUSMA. Maybe we'll get into why this thing has so many names. And the Canadian-European Union Trade Agreement, CETA, as well as he was also Steve served as the special advisor on trade policy to Canada's Deputy Minister of Finance. He was Canada's chief agriculture negotiator from 2003 to 2009, responsible for leading Canada's involvement in international trade negotiations on agriculture, including at the WTO. Like I said, heavy hitter. Steve, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I have so many questions. We could go for 3 hours. We talked on a phone call, and we're like, okay, we got to dial this back, Shaun. You're too excited. Okay, 100,000 feet. Have geopolitics always played such a prominent role in trade and the negotiations of better trade?
No, they haven't. I think that back a number of years ago, the consensus was we needed to keep politics out of trade and let the markets operate trade and the rules operate trade, and the whole idea of negotiating trade rules was to keep political decisions out of it. And there was general buy-in on that across the world, almost all countries, but that has definitely changed.
Does this put Canada at a disadvantage?
It absolutely does, because I think Canada, as a mid-sized country, relies on rules and trade to be on a level playing field with the U.S. and China and Europe and other countries that are much bigger, carry much more power. So we need politics kept out of it. We need rules-based trade. And if it's an environment where it's just the law of the jungle, then the larger countries are going to have a much easier time than we will.
Yeah. That's been my perception, is it's easy for example, let's pick on the U.S. because, south of us, largest economy in the world, we do a lot of trade with them, we compete with them. It is much easier for them to sort of be the bully in the room, like, if you don't do this, we're going to do that. That's tougher for Canada to throw its weight around. We're, geographically, we're a large country, but from an economic power standpoint, we don't have some of those advantages. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair, which is why not only do we need rules-based trade and then rely on those rules to help level that playing field, but we also need to work with allies. So we're not that powerful on our own, so we need to have alliances with similar countries with similar interests. Sometimes that's the bigger ones, like the U.S. on some issues, or Europe on some issues. But we also need to work with other mid-sized countries that have the same kinds of concerns.
Okay, so that's the multilateral approach, which is like the agreements where we have multiple countries all in one agreement, the CPTPP, USMCA. But the U.S. and China have been moving forward more on a bilateral strategy. That's different. Why is that, and should Canada be pursuing that method?
Well, there has been a large growth in bilateral agreements. There's been a large growth in bilateral relations and efforts, but and Canada does that and needs to continue to do that, and that's probably where our most important efforts need to take place, particularly our bilateral relations with the U.S. as our largest trading partner, but also our allies in Europe and others. The U.S. doesn't have much of a bilateral relationship with China right now,
yeah.
So it's more an issue of tension than any kind of collaboration on issues.
It's a bit of a roller coaster between the two of them. It feels. One week it's like, oh, we're back on, and the next week we're back off. It's like a junior high school dating relationship, it feels at times.
Yeah.
I like to make comparisons. I'm not sure if that's an accurate one, but anyway. Okay. Now, I mentioned the WTO earlier. You said rules-based trade. When I think of rules-based trade, I think of the WTO, or what we aspire the WTO to be again. How much reformation has to happen at the WTO level so it can enforce that rules-based trade that you're talking about?
Well, I think the WTO at the moment is kind of fundamentally broken. Dispute settlement is not working because the U.S. has blocked the formation of appellate boards. So there's no effective dispute settlement. There's no real effort to try to move any kind of negotiations forward successfully. There's a WTO ministerial happening right now, and there's very little coverage of it because there's very little happening.
Expectations are low. Is that why?
Expectations are low, and there's just the divisions, the gaps between positions are just simply too large at this point.
Okay, so for Canada, we believe in rules-based trade. We hear from both sides of the aisle, the political aisle, I should say. If we have little faith or low expectations on the WTO being effective, what levers does Canada have to play as geopolitics are really infiltrating trade discussions?
Well, I think we're putting less efforts into the WTO these days for those reasons, but a lot more effort into our bilateral relationships. And certainly we still have trade rules in CUSMA or USMCA or whatever you want to call it. I mean, those rules are extremely important to us now, as are our rules with the EU and others where we have trade agreements. So bilateral trade agreements are functioning somewhat better than the WTO, but still have more weaknesses than they used to.
Okay, so a couple things I really want to pinpoint on here that are definitely in the news from a trade perspective, and there's some geopolitics around them. We're going to have a renegotiation in 2026 of the CUSMA agreement. We're going to have a new government in Mexico. We're going to have a new government, or an election, I should say. We're going to have an election in Canada, and we're going to have an election in the U.S. between now and then. So we don't really know who all the players are. We have expectations, and Daryl's got a bunch of polling he's going to talk about. What exactly does this renegotiation look like? Because the last renegotiation felt incredibly painful and long.
It was.
Is this you were in the room. You probably have a lot of stories you could tell us. Maybe over beer later you can share those with me. But what does this look like? Is this a repeat performance?
Well, I want to start by saying it's not actually a renegotiation. It can be a renegotiation, but it's not required to be. On July 1st, 2026, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico are going to have to confirm in writing that they want the agreement to continue. And if that just happens without much else going on, then we're full steam ahead. If one of those countries decides they're not going to formally commit to the continuation, then we're into a world of uncertainty because the agreement will be in a state of having to be reviewed every year on an ongoing basis until something changes or it expires in 10 years. But I think beyond that, there's an expectation that as we lead up to July 1st, 2026, the U.S. in particular will start pushing for some kind of changes. So there could be a negotiation that develops, and there could be a forward work plan coming out of that.
If we were to talk to Las Vegas, I would assume that the smart money would be betting that Democrat or Republican, the U.S. is not just rubber stamping this and moving forward. It's very politically appealing in the U.S. right now as protectionism grows to say that, hey, this isn't working out for us. We need to fix this. We're getting, we're getting screwed on the trade deal. Is that fair, or am I getting way ahead of myself?
No, I think our hope is that there will be bigger issues that countries are focused on, and this will be a little bit more under the radar, but I think that's wishful thinking. I think that the U.S. will seek to make some changes and try to get Mexico and Canada to make some commitments during those discussions. And I think the one issue that really concerns me is that I keep hearing rumblings, particularly out of the Trump camp, that they may try to overturn some of the dispute settlement decisions through the review.
Because the big one in this room that everybody's aware of is on the dairy dispute resolution panels, the two of them, Canada claimed victory. Now on the first one, U.S. claimed victory as well, which is always interesting when both sides win. But in the second one, Canada felt like the winner, and the U.S. acknowledged that. But that's getting back to the rules-based trade. Rules as long as my side wins. Is that one of the challenges here?
That is one of the challenges, because I think we've seen the U.S., maybe more than most other countries, becoming less attached to the rules of law if it interferes with their domestic objectives. And so that's going to be the challenge going forward. Okay,
I got to ask you. Somebody's like, you got to ask him. Other people are like, don't ask him. I'm going to ask him. Bill C-282. This is the piece of legislation that would Basically, somebody like yourself, the trade negotiator, would have legislation where you couldn't give up further market access for supply managed commodities. You have sat in many negotiating rooms. Is this an effective way for Canada to defend supply management?
Well, it is a tricky question. I think from a negotiator's perspective, you never want to go to the table and immediately take things off if you can avoid it. Because then the other side, of course, has an opening to take things off on their side. But when you start those negotiations, each side always has its red lines. They're usually not a surprise, so you negotiate from there. So I really see this more as a political signal of support to the dairy sector and to supply management more broadly, because we've really already negotiated with most of the major dairy exporters to Canada. We have the US, New Zealand, Australia, Europe. So there's no other imminent threat out there. I think the era of the big negotiations is probably over for the foreseeable future. So I don't think there's actually an imminent threat coming. And I think that this is, about politics, about expressing support. I don't expect it's going to have a huge impact on what limited negotiations we have going forward.
Okay, that kind of makes sense, and that's kind of what I've heard. Like what I've heard out of the U.S. when I talk to people in D.C. is the main question I get is, what are you guys doing? Because if you were to do this, it's sort of like when you tell your kid they can't have the candy, right? It actually, what does the kid want? The kid wants the candy more.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the comparison that I've heard from a lot of people on that. Now, from a geopolitical standpoint, as we see geopolitical issues rise related to trade, one of the things that scares me, and maybe you're going to reassure me here, but we're hearing a lot about carbon border adjustments. Now, in academia and in theory, I understand why carbon tariffs, why you would have them, why they make sense. But as we see geopolitical and protectionism rise, this feels like a really scary proposition for people to be using sustainability as a shield in front of protectionism. What are your thoughts on carbon border adjustments?
Well, I think there's a number of efforts being made, and certainly carbon border adjustment is one of them, to try to find a way to resolve a situation where if a producer is having to pay significant additional costs to meet sustainability objectives, they're not going to want to compete with imports from another country where none of that is being done. So they could price themselves out of the market just by all the extra expenses they're having to pay. So I think there is a need down the road, particularly as this advances further, that there's some kind of mechanism to try to account for that, so that producers that are doing all the environmental measures that they're being asked to take and adding expenses to their operations as a result shouldn't have to compete with imports from a country where the producer is doing none of that, facing none of those costs. So I think the challenge right now is that carbon border adjustment I don't think is the right solution. The U.S. has ideas of forming a small club and imposing tariffs against countries that are not meeting those objectives. So something needs to be done, but there's no coherent effort right now. I think there needs to be a broader, more coherent effort to try to decide, how do we resolve this? How do we make this adjustment?
I really hope we're in that club.
Well, the problem is there isn't a club yet. There needs to be a club. There needs to be a group of countries figuring out what kind of rule would make sense, and then try to get that into at least a larger group of countries, if not multilaterally. Okay.
Final question, then we've got to get to our panel. But when you're in a trade negotiation, I imagine what that's like. We've all sat down and tried to buy a car, and we've bartered back and forth. What really, it's not like that, but really what is it like in that room when you're trying to, you really have the economic, Canada's a very trade-dependent nation, so you have a lot of our GDP is dependent on what you negotiate. Mm-hmm. It's on your shoulders. So what does it really look like inside that room?
Well, the rooms vary a lot. The negotiations that I did with the European Union, it was fairly collaborative, fairly constructive. We're aiming for more or less the same kind of targets, and it was about moving towards freer trade. The negotiations with the U.S., it was the complete opposite. The U.S. was seeking to rebalance the agreement and take away things from Canada and from Mexico and scale back on freer trade, more restrictive. So it was a much more tense, much more confrontational kind of atmosphere in that room. And it did become quite heated at times. The gaps were quite wide. So it varies on the negotiating partner. It varies on the issue.
We're continuing our conversation with Steve Verheul. We're off the stage. Now we're in a side hallway, continuing the conversation about some of the trade issues that Canada faces going forward. Steve, I'm really interested when it comes to the you clarified it, not a renegotiation, but when this expiration or renewal process has to happen when it comes to the USMCA CUSMA agreement. Canada is engaging again in this Team Canada approach. Okay, and this is my speculation, has been because of rising protectionism in the U.S. on both sides of the aisle. Mm-hmm. Canada's Team Canada approach, we may get a few frostier conversations than maybe we had the last time in some of those state capitals and when we go to D.C. to talk to members of Congress. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think the lines will be a little bit sharper this time than they were last time. I think it will be more difficult to get U.S. allies on our side than it was then. So yes, no, I think it will be more challenging. The environment is different. The divisions in the U.S. are exacerbating some of those issues. So it will be different, more difficult, I think.
What do you feel that it will be the same issues coming forward again? Autos, steel, aluminum, on the agriculture side, supply management. Those are the ones, at least, that were in the mainstream media as far as here's what the big issues are that have to be renegotiated. Are those the main focuses still, or are there new ones?
Those are still the main ones. I would add the digital sales tax to that because that's likely to be a contentious issue depending on how it goes. There will also be issues that the U.S. will have to be focused on Mexico about, which could help us indirectly if those are bigger issues than our issues. But yes, supply management, autos, the whole range of usual issues.
What is more challenging? Negotiating a multilateral agreement where we've got 6, 8, 10 countries, or one where there's 3 countries? And why I specifically say 3 is we've all been in an office environment where when you have 3 people, it can be really difficult because people play off each other, and there's somebody that is sort of left on the outside. Talk about the challenges of. Well, I'll ask you, which one is actually more friendly to negotiate in?
Well, I'd say it's a little bit more complicated to negotiate with a broader group of countries, but it's easier in the sense that you can have shifting alliances on different issues. You may have 3 or 4 countries with you on one issue, but not another, and a different set of countries on another issue. So it's complicated, but easier because you can play with more tools.
Yeah. Well, we all remember during the CUSMA USMCA negotiation when Mexico and the U.S. found common ground, and it was portrayed that Canada was potentially on the outside. Take us back to that moment and what was going through your head and what the realities were of that, and what was being said in the media. Was that actually accurate to the situation?
No, it wasn't. And I'll take you just one step further back. When the negotiations first started, the U.S. was frustrated because Mexico and Canada were largely ganging up on them and telling them that some of their ideas just weren't acceptable. So the U.S. realized that wasn't working and wanted to move towards more of a bilateral set of meetings and occasional trilateral sets of meetings. So yes, the U.S. and Mexico did talk extensively. They had more difficulties on their side, on their issues, so they needed more time. But throughout that period, I was in close communication with my U.S. counterpart, with my Mexican counterpart. I knew what was happening in those rooms. There were no surprises, and we were able to feed ideas into those rooms at the same time. So not too worried about it. We knew we'd be back at the table without any doors closed that we couldn't find a way through.
Was there ever a point where you at the end of the day sat down and said, I'm not sure where this is actually going? Or were you always steadfast, confident, there's a deal here to be done and we're going to find it?
In the early going, that question was in the front of my mind and everybody's mind, I think, because the U.S. came out the door with 5 or 6 proposals that were entirely unacceptable to us. We would have been better off with no agreement at all than accept those proposals. So we did have to start studying what is it going to look like if we do not have a NAFTA going forward? And eventually the U.S. started to dilute those proposals, weaken those proposals, and we started to have more traction on a real negotiation. But when they put those first set of proposals on the table, I thought that it was going to be a long shot to be able to get a successful outcome.
Is that some of the strong points that they had when it came to country of origin on components to do with auto? Was that some of those original asks, or what was it?
Well, they actually had an original ask on autos that it had to have a minimum 50% of U.S. content rather than North American content, and a ridiculously high amount of overall content in the car, which would have made them uncompetitive with other regions in the world. They also said they wanted a complete end to supply management, which would be difficult for us, of course. They wanted to end dispute settlement processes as they were working in the past. And all of these were just, completely unacceptable to us. They would have made the agreement virtually worthless.
I follow those negotiations very quickly, or very closely, I should say. That's actually when those negotiations started is about the same time as we started RealAg Radio on Rural Radio, and so we had a lot of U.S. farmers listening to our program to ask questions and better understand, what is this supply management thing that's being discussed that I'm hearing so much about? Of course, Sonny Perdue, at the time the USDA secretary, famously said, Canada, you can keep your supply management, we just want access. And I remember that quote that he put out there at Commodity Classic, which is happening this week, very, very famously. A lot of times what we're seeing, and this is the geopolitical side of the equation, I think of CETA, in the terms of we have an agreement, but boy, the technicals, I'll call them, you probably have a better official name for that, but the technicals, the ability to actually get product into the region, it's challenging. Does Canada need like a trade enforcement officer? We've heard about this. Europe has one. Catherine Tai, the USTR, I guess, sort of functions more from an enforcement standpoint. Do we need more of this on the Canadian side on our team?
Well, I think there is an increasing focus on that already. Whether or not you have a particular office or person that's going to be addressing that is maybe helpful in terms of the public profile, but that's an ongoing struggle that governments are trying to address. I think the European market is always a difficult market to get into because of all of the regulations. We have advantages over others now with CETA, but still, it's something we have to keep chipping away at.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So easier said than done is what you're saying to clear up some of these. Okay, so right now, when it comes to some of those technicals, the UK walked away from Canada. Beef and pork are a big part of that. We are asking the UK to accept our carcass wash process. Is this something that you feel can be easily fixed, or is this really a stalemate that is going to continue for quite some time? The carcass wash issue in particular is very difficult because the UK will want to stay very close to what the EU requires, and they won't want many changes between the UK treatment at the border and the EU's treatment at the border. So that will be an ongoing issue. But we did manage to get 4 different types of carcass washes accepted. Still working on more. So I think we're gradually getting there. But if I can go on just a little bit longer on that one, part of the problem is that we have not taken the steps domestically to set up our production in a way that will meet EU requirements. There's lots of countries that export beef to the EU without any difficulty. We've got Australia, New Zealand, most of Latin America. There's 12 or 14 countries that are exporting beef to the EU. We could do it. We just have to have slightly different systems than we have for exporting beef to the US, for example. So it's a question of whether the economic value is there to make those changes to allow us to get in. And I would imagine the industry is saying we don't want to have segregation or changing things up on the line based on the market we're going into.
That's where we're at, I think. And when we first negotiated the deal with the EU, I was told that we were going to have a 500,000 herd of hormone-free cattle, and that we were going to have a separate line that would be producing for the EU. And I think the judgment of the exporters was just that's not worth the kind of effort and expense to get into the EU market. So that's where we're kind of stuck.
Curious, you have, as the chief trade negotiator, you have to be really knowledgeable and almost an expert in many, many different facets. Talk about that, and do you bring in experts in each of those industries, or like what? So when you walk into that room, you know what you're talking about, and you know where what you're standing on. How do you backfill that knowledge?
Well, it helps to have a really good team, and having been through a number of big negotiations, I think our team was certainly the best in the world in terms of all of that. I had 35 negotiators of different areas with me. I had a team of over 300, and so they feed up the essential information to me, and I recognize the importance of understanding the details. If you understand the details better than your counterpart across the table, you have a big advantage. So a lot of emphasis on that. But yeah, hours and hours of reading notes.
It's like being back in university. Okay, I want to finish up with this. I read Robert Lighthizer book, former USTR for the U.S. You sat across the table from him. He is very famous, putting on that kind of curmudgeon, hard, tough negotiator. He has very strong thoughts on the Trump trade policy. What was it like being in the room negotiating with Secretary Lighthizer?
It was tough. There were certainly tough moments, and I think on some issues we certainly had big gaps, and it was difficult to get any kind of common ground. So there were some heated discussions through that. But I do have to say that at the end of the day, there was a kind of a grudging respect on both sides, because in the end we were trying to advance our own country's interests the best we could. So I would say that we left that experience on fairly good relations, recognizing we'd been through a bit of a battle. You
earlier you were saying that there were some big unacceptable asks during the CUSMA USMCA negotiation process. The new version of that could be the 10% import tariff on all goods coming to the U.S. that the former President Trump is talking about again if reelected. That seems like that's going to be one that Canada's going to be talking about a lot.
Yeah, it's certainly not clear whether Canada and Mexico would be excluded from that 10% across-the-board tariff. He's also saying he wants to match the tariffs of any other country that has higher tariffs than the U.S. does. All of that is completely illegal under virtually any U.S. trade agreement. So lots of battles to be had there, but I think the worst part of it all is that this isn't in the U.S. interest either. It will have a negative impact on them. So hopefully, a campaign promise, but hopefully it gets watered down by the time if he actually comes into office again.
Well, Steve, it's been great to meet you, be able to work with you on stage today. I hope this isn't our last chat. I think there's a lot of trade issues to talk about in the future. I look forward to our next discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.